Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Fundraising in the COVID-19 Economy. My name is Nancy Flores, and I'm the Deputy Director at the National Partnership for New Americans, NPNA, the lead host organization putting together this year's National Immigrant Integration Conference. I will be one of your moderators today, and I'm so happy to be co-moderating today's session with Ben Barge from the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, who's right here. Ben will introduce himself in just a moment, but I want to tell you a little bit about what we're talking about in this session. Today's conversation will focus on how immigrant and refugee justice groups can raise money and improve foundation behavior in the era of COVID-19 and beyond. Specifically, we're going to share how to achieve this on the movement's terms, rather than the other way around. You'll hear from some great speakers who are going to share how they've actually done it, real case studies and stories from the crowd. It goes without saying how just uncertain this year has been for many of you, especially those that manage organizational budgets, raise money for your organization or local government agency, manage programs, any of these leadership roles. This session is for you. We hope to provide really concrete tools that will help your fundraising efforts. You can expect to come out of this session feeling empowered and equipped with new tools to fundraise for your organization's amazing mission. But that's not all we'll do. At this time, I'll turn it over to Ben Barge, my co-moderator, who will take us through what else you can expect from today's session. Ben, take it away.
Thanks, Nancy, and thanks to all of you for making the time today. As Nancy said, this session is about you and making sure that all of your work responding to the pandemic, preparing for a new administration, protecting our communities from deportation and the threats from structural racism and long-term movement building is funded at the levels that you deserve. My job is to give a bit more context for what we know about the funding landscape before we dive into this great conversation. So as Nancy said, I'm Ben Barge. I'm the field director at the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, or NCRP. And for those who don't know us, NCRP is a multiracial, multi-issue national nonprofit founded 40 years ago by community organizers and grassroots groups to make sure that philanthropy is responsive and accountable to those with the least wealth, power, and opportunity. So we use research and base building and strategic campaigns to make sure that movements for equity and justice in this country have the resources they need to thrive. And if Troy, if you'll bring up the first slide, we've been working closely with immigrant and refugee justice leaders for years through our Movement Investment Project. And on our website, you can look up a lot of great interactive data about funding for immigrants and refugees. But just to give you a sense of headlines or takeaways before we dive in, historically, foundation funding explicitly marked to benefit immigrants and refugees has only been about 1% to 2% of foundations' grants. And in fact, in many years, leisure sports have received more funding than the pro-immigrant, pro-refugee movement has. Also, we know that groups that work locally, do grassroots organizing, work in more conservative areas politically, or are led by and focused on Black, API, MASA, and or LGBTQ immigrant and refugee communities tend to be even more underfunded. The good news is that we know that funding has substantially increased since 2016, partly in a response to the Trump administration, but we still know that it's still wildly short of what our communities and what the pro-immigrant, pro-refugee movement deserves. So as Nancy said, in this session, we'll talk about a variety of ways that you can be more successful in your work with funders and have more power in those relationships. And if you're interested in learning more, just a quick plug, NCRP will be hosting a philanthropy power analysis training at the 2021 NIC next year. And you can also follow NCRP at any of these places, including me directly. So much more to come. I'll hand things back over to Nancy.
Thank you, Ben. And I also want to plug that NCRP is a member organization. So if the tools that Ben shared are interesting to you or you think that your organization could benefit, feel free to reach out and we can connect you there or check out their website. So with that, I think that we're ready to get started. So before we get into the substance of our conversation, we want to introduce you to today's wonderful panel. So I will introduce our first panelist here. Her name is Heather Infantry with Transformation Alliance. She is the arts and culture champion for the Transformation Alliance, a collective advancing equitable, transit-oriented development as a pathway to prosperity and opportunity. In May, Heather led an effort exposing the Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta of redlining the Black arts community, resulting in an unprecedented contribution of over $1 million to Black organizations. Please welcome our first panelist, Heather Infantry. Welcome, Heather.
Thanks.
I'll turn it over to Ben to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Nancy. We also have with us here today Sundrop Carter, who is the executive director of PIC in Pennsylvania, stepping into the role after 2 years as organizing director. Sundrop always knew that she would be part of movements to advance social justice, being raised by hippie parents. And before PIC, Sundrop worked with organizations and activist projects supporting immigrant workers fighting for justice at their workplaces. She received her BA from Clark University and JD from Brooklyn Law. Nancy?
All right, so our next speaker is Ravika Rajkishun. Ravika is a nonprofit fundraising and communications expert and community organizer, currently serving as interim co-executive director at the New York Immigration Coalition, the NYIC. Born and raised in Guyana, Ravika immigrated to Brooklyn, New York at age 10. She has spent the last 2 decades helping community-based organizations build their sustainability and capacity. Ravika has committed her career to progressive causes, including gender equity, racial justice, workforce development, civic engagement, and of course, immigrant rights. Ravika, welcome to today's panel. We're so happy to have you joining us today.
Thank you, Nancy. Glad to be here.
We also have Kevin Douglas with us today from GSER, Grantmakers concerned with immigrants and refugees. Kevin joined GSER in February 2019 and has more than 13 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. He most recently worked as the co-director of policy and advocacy for United Neighborhood Houses of New York, which is a network of New York City settlement houses and community centers. While there, he led advocacy campaigns that resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars in investments in community services by city and state governments. His areas of focus included immigrant opportunity, youth education and skill building, nonprofit contracting, older adult programs, and community services at large. So welcome, Kevin.
Thanks, Ben.
Last but not least, Monica Munn leads World Education Services philanthropic arm, which invests in catalytic organizations and leaders working to ensure immigrant and refugee workers can thrive to build more inclusive and equitable economies in the US and Canada. She previously managed global jobs, food security, and rural energy initiatives at the Rockefeller Foundation. Earlier in her career, Monica worked at a social enterprise, Next Street, that focuses on ensuring entrepreneurs and small businesses in Black, Latinx, and underinvested communities to access capital and drive equitable growth. Monica currently serves in the steering committee of the Workforce Matters Funders Network. Welcome, Monica.
Hi, everyone. Wonderful to be here with you today.
Great. And at this time, we're going to dive in and get started with our panel discussion. If you have questions for our panelists at any time, please enter them in the chat, and we'll try to address all of them throughout the presentation. Nancy, do you want to take the first question?
Sure thing. And we'll try to get to all the questions in the chat. Each session is different, so if we get a lot of questions, I do apologize ahead of time, but we'll do our best to answer them in the chat. All right, so our first question, this one is for Ravika. So a big part of fundraising is telling your organization or community's story. Many of the organizations joining today have been on the front lines doing various things to respond to this pandemic, including but not limited to distributing cash assistance, pivoting their services to virtual formats, and many, many more things. Ravika, as someone who's served as an organizer, an executive director, and fundraiser, what tips do you have for someone who's either newer to fundraising or juggling a bunch of things in addition to fundraising, especially in this moment? How can people best tell their COVID-19 story as it relates to fundraising.
Thank you, Nancy and Ben. I'm pleased to be part of this panel and to have this opportunity to share our experiences during the last 10 months. I'd like to speak about what we did and what we learned during the first few months of the pandemic. I'll talk both about storytelling and fundraising, and I'll share tips as I go, and I hope they're helpful. As Nancy mentioned, my name is Ravika Rajkishan, and I'm the interim co-executive director of the New York Immigration Coalition, a role I took on in September. To tell you a little bit about the New York Immigration Coalition, we're one of the oldest and largest statewide coalition representing 200 plus members across New York State. We think of ourselves as the convener in the room that provides leadership to nonprofits, government agencies, businesses, and others to find and implement solutions to some of the big challenges that face immigrants today. Prior to my current role, I was Vice President of Development and Communications, so I oversaw all of our fundraising and communications work. And I've spent 2 decades fundraising for nonprofits and training other fundraisers and executive directors, including some who are very new to their roles. Under my leadership, the New York Immigration Coalition tripled our revenues, and this allowed us to grow our staff and presence across the state. So that is all to say that I know a great deal about juggling a lot of roles, and my first and most important tip is you need to build a great team that is capable, ambitious, and energized by the mission. This is essential and hard work and is always my top priority. And your team doesn't need to include just staff members. It includes your allies, your board of directors, and others who are willing to do the work with you. Fundraising is not a one-person sport, and I never do it alone. I ask for help from all of the folks that I just mentioned. As we all know, the pandemic hit New York very hard in March. I was actually home with a 1-month-old when this happened. And so in many ways, I was already in quarantine, but it was quite a dramatic moment. We knew we needed to pivot our work quickly. The NYC's immigrant serving member organizations were struggling. The demand for assistance from our communities was unprecedented and overwhelming. Many member organizations are under-resourced and are facing cuts and financial losses. We knew we needed to do more and to move quickly. The stories we were hearing were so heartbreaking, from multiple family members being infected with COVID, multiple family members passing away due to the lack of access to care, families losing their jobs and barely having any savings to continue to pay for housing, food, and medicine. We've all seen the long lines at food pantries across the country. The top line actions we took within the first 10 weeks included raising $2.7 million for emergency cash assistance for individuals who had lost work and were not eligible for any form of relief, many of whom were undocumented immigrants. These funds were distributed through our member organizations, enabling them to do more and serving as a magnet to their other services. We filed for the Paycheck Protection Program and raised the funds needed to hire a consultant to assist our member organizations who needed help to also put in their applications. We planned and held our first ever virtual gala in 4 weeks and raised $250,000 to support all of the needs stemming from the pandemic. All of this happened as we move our 60 plus staff members all to remote work from 5 different regions across the state. Even as all of this was happening, from the very beginning, we focused on storytelling. We focused on listening to our member organizations and seeing the challenges from their perspectives, while also looking at the whole picture of their combined needs and concerns. And we were determined to act and lead. From the start, we poured a great deal into our communications efforts, both through our own channels and in placing stories in various news outlets. We were very specific about what message we want to convey and repeated it over and over again. Immigrants are essential to our economy and our recovery. Immigrants are on the front line of this pandemic, yet they're not getting access to any form of relief. The pandemic is disproportionately affecting immigrant communities, and so on. So my second tip is to get your messaging down on paper and share it with your ambassadors and make sure everyone is staying on point. We then blasted out that messaging in every possible way. We broke all the rules in terms of how often we sent email blasts or a full list, and this also paid off in terms of online giving. We worked to stay close to our various audiences through frequent and compelling communications. We discovered design and illustration talent among our staff, which enabled us to put together visually strong images that illustrated how essential immigrants are and how they were being affected by the pandemic. We emphasize telling stories of essential workers during COVID and of the recipients of our emergency cash assistance program, knowing that immigrant stories needed to be told and that our stories and lived experiences have value. We also prepared social media toolkits for our member organizations so they can get messaging out as quickly and easily as possible. In the world we live in, with all of the different audiences we're trying to reach, there's no one way to tell our stories. We need to communicate through multiple channels and to uplift the messages of others. For funders, we prepared several high-level short documents which we use to keep them abreast of our work. The first focused on COVID-related advocacy wins for immigrant communities, and the second covered the emergency cash assistance program. And we did a mini report highlighting our impact during COVID. So my third tip is, especially right now when we're all juggling work from home and caregiving duties, is to keep everything short and high level. There just simply isn't enough time for us to put together very long pieces or for people to really delve into them. The pandemic inspired many people to step up and join our movement. We were attentive and found ways to make new friends and allies. Comic Wyatt Cenac retweeted us and we connected with him. A high-end hip-hop designer had a sale to benefit us, and a Mexican artist donated prints which were sold to benefit our work. Other friends in media and entertainment helped us find talent for a virtual gala. We work hard to engage all of our staff, board members, and allies in making connections, opening doors, and sharing potential leads. One person can't possibly do this all. It takes all of us. And finally, I want to be forward-focused as we think about how we will tell the stories of immigrants as we work with a new federal administration and fight for things like immigration reform. We're all going to have to work really hard to change what has been a toxic and racist narrative of immigrants by a toxic and racist federal government. The stories of immigrants and our lived experience and our value to this country are important to be told, and who better than us all here to push that narrative forward. I want to thank you so much for your interest in the essential work you all do, and I'm really glad to be here with everyone and to speak about this kind of work.
Thank you so much, Rovika, for your remarks and just the incredible work and leadership, and for those great words, pearls of wisdom. I'll turn it over to Ben, who's going to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks to you both. Heather, this next question is for you. The data bears out what we already know, that funding for our communities is not as high as it should be. We also know that anti-Blackness is prevalent throughout the philanthropic sector, and to that end, your story is really important and instructive for all of us. You worked with your community this summer to challenge your local foundation on its grant making, ultimately raising over $1 million for Black-led organizations in Georgia. That story is not over yet. So tell us, what have you learned from this campaign and what's happened since? What strategies did you find helpful?
Yes, Ben, thank you for the question. Just to give a little bit more context to what actually happened in Atlanta. So sometime in May, the Community Foundation for Great Atlanta did a round of COVID emergency relief funding. They had done some rounds of funding for, I would say, health and human service organizations, but later on in a cycle, they decided to designate some funding specifically to arts and culture organizations, which was incredible for the arts community because there had been great concern that they would have been left out of the COVID relief funding just because there is oftentimes this perception that arts and culture isn't one of those necessities, particularly when you find yourself in a crisis. What was staggering about this particular round of funding that they had done in its first cycle, which was about $500,000 of resources that they deployed, is that they had excluded, of the 11 grantees, Black arts organizations. And at this point in the pandemic, we had become unequivocally clear that the pandemic was having a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown communities. And so for the Community Foundation in a city like Atlanta that is referenced around the country as the Black Mecca, a city that has an incredibly visible and vibrant Black community, for Black organizations to be excluded in a round of funding during a crisis like this brought a lot of attention and scrutiny. And I had noted that in their announcement and decided to take to social media to express both my frustration and disappointment in what the Community Foundation was doing. What I guess resulted from that was an all-out push that later revealed that not just in this pandemic, the Community Foundation had excluded, in a lot of ways, had been redlining Black arts organizations, but they had been doing that since the inception of a particular arts fund that they have, 27 years, 87% of the funding was going to white-led organizations that weren't only just white-led, but they were serving majority white audiences. They were telling Western European stories, and their donor base was largely white. 10% of the funding over the 27-year cycle of that fund was going to Black-led organizations. And so that became a rallying point for the Black arts and culture community, in which I really tried to bring together this sector in a way that we had never really gotten together before. And part of the strategy was to identify who all of those players were, because I didn't know everybody in the Black arts and culture community, even though I'd been in this city for 20 plus years and had been well entrenched in my advocacy and activism for arts funding. So galvanizing the community, bringing us together in a particular way to have a unified voice was definitely part of the strategy. And a week after they had made their announcement following the call out, we would then learn about Derek Chauvin's murdering of George Floyd. And so leveraging a crisis to further drive home the narrative of redlining of Black arts organizations was also part of the tactic. I earlier in the year had an opportunity to spend some time in New Orleans preparing for a conference that was later postponed. But one of the takeaways that really helped to inform the strategy that I employed with this Black arts uprising was that they were finding post-Katrina that funders were pulling away. They had this onslaught of interest and investment in their community at the point of Katrina, but over a couple of years, they were seeing that funders were beginning to pull out. And we had noted in this conversation that crisis oftentimes brings the attention that we're always wanting to get from funders. And so recalling that moment where crisis can be a leveraging point for advancing your fundraising, particularly knowing that crisis will always arise in the kind of work that we find ourselves doing. How can we prepare and anticipate when a crisis may happen so that we can leverage it to our advantage? And so the racial reckoning moment was just the perfect backdrop in order to apply the very necessary pressure that was needed in order to get the Community Foundation to take the concerns and the demands of the Black arts community seriously. In addition to that, I also tapped my circle of influence, right? As someone who has been fundraising for 15 plus years, I've gotten to know a lot of the prominent funders and donors in Atlanta. And I knew that some of those folks either served on the board or had funds, donor advised funds held at the Community Foundation. And so I reached out to those individuals. I told them the story of what was happening, and I appealed to them to apply pressure. I didn't ask for them to take a side, but instead what I wanted them to do, and what many of them did, was I wanted them to contact the leadership of the Community Foundation to express concern, to express that they were aware of the situation and that they were very curious as to how the Community Foundation was going to resolve this issue. I needed, in this advocacy effort and campaign, for the Community Foundation to feel the pressure coming from all sides, from those of us that are on the ground in the community, from those that are inside the institution as funders and donors. I needed it to come from every angle so that they had no choice but to respond. Part of the demands that we made included changing some of the guidelines for how they sort of make eligible and qualified organizations to apply. And we also had some demands around level of funding, and then also what we wanted to see the Community Foundation do after subsequent rounds of funding related to COVID. And they met most of those demands, and in some cases they made some changes that were better than we had anticipated and had asked for. But at the conclusion of this 3-month campaign, 23 Black-led arts organizations ranging from new to longstanding institutions received a total of just over 1.1 million, which was incredibly unprecedented. Most of these organizations had never received funding from the Community Foundation, was not even on the Community Foundation's radar. And so in a press release that I had put together, I talked about the historical significance of this moment, referenced this as philanthropic reparations just to enter into the larger discourse, this kind of language, and also to hold the foundation accountable to future opportunities for supporting Black-led organizations, that they had set a precedent that could be applied to other grant-making areas, and that we could always point to this as a model of something that they were able to do in a very short amount of time. As far as what is happening now, a wonderful byproduct of this whole experience has been the way the Black arts and culture community has come together. And there are numerous conversations that are going on now. There's an effort around seeking reparations. There are other funders for which inequity continues to challenge and exclude Black organizations. And so there are efforts to look at those funders. There's also more collaboration that we're finding and camaraderie and trust that's being built. So it's an ongoing conversation. And as far as the Community Foundation, they are now putting together a task force of Black arts leaders and civic leaders to think about and to advise them on how to ensure that their grant making going forward is more equitable.
Thank you, Heather. I love that story, and also the idea of philanthropic reparations. There's so many great lessons from your story, from collective pressure to tapping your network to this kind of multi-stage campaign. But thank you for sharing. I'll hand things back over to Nancy.
Thanks, Ben and Heather. And I know that in the beginning of the session, we mentioned who we're tailoring this conversation for. And this is a lot of folks that are working on the ground. But funders are absolutely welcome to this conversation as well, as we're really diving into these topics and seeing how we can collectively do the big work that we're doing to create social change, how we can collectively do it better. And I love echo Ben's points on Heather's story and just the incredible work. And that takes guts, that takes leadership. And I think that that's something that was really important for us to share here so that people can see what's possible. So we'll move forward here with our next speaker, Sundrop. The question is for you. So the Pennsylvania Immigrant and Citizenship Coalition does collaborative, member-led grant making through Pennsylvania is Ready Fund. You also led an event this summer with organizers and foundations, challenging local funders to give more to the movement. Tell us about your experience in building the power of your members to raise and direct money collectively rather than in isolation.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'm excited to be here today as part of this panel. So first, just to share a little bit about us, PIC is a statewide immigrant rights coalition that brings together organizations across Pennsylvania to advocate for pro-immigrant policies at the local, state, and federal levels. We also conduct voter engagement with new citizens, provide capacity building support to our members, and coordinate PA is Ready, which is a participatory grant making fund. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that in a little bit. One of our core values as an organization is really centering the leadership of immigrant and refugee communities, because we firmly believe that the movement for immigrant rights must be led by immigrants and refugees. And so as an advocacy coalition, this means we intentionally center the voices of our grassroots members and work to bring in members that work in communities that are often marginalized or underrepresented in immigration spaces, such as Black and API immigrants. I also believe that this value applies to philanthropy and how the movement of money and resources across organizations and movements happens. And so just like policy conversations must center those whose well-being is most impacted by those policy decisions, conversations about how resources and funding are allocated must also center those whose well-being are going to be most impacted by those decisions and the allocation of wealth. And that means people who are generally excluded from accessing those resources and the communities whose labor created the wealth in the first place. As Ben mentioned earlier, one thing we do know about resource and funding allocation is that Black-led organizations, immigrant-led organizations, grassroots organizations, and organizations focused on systems change are all under-resourced and are often excluded from philanthropy spaces. Obviously, we as one organization can't solve this issue alone, but we do think that as a coalition, we have a role in helping to bridge that gap and leverage our power and our access to support our grassroots partners and to build a more collaborative approach to fundraising. So we do this through a couple ways, which I will talk through. One is through coordinating PA's Ready, a participatory grant-making fund. We also do a lot of subgranting to our members, and we have built a robust capacity building program. So first off, PA's Ready is a program that was created in 2014 by PIC member organizations in response to the prospect of DAPA, or Deferred Action of Parents. We knew in Pennsylvania that if this policy went through, our organizations collectively just did not have the capacity to deal with the influx of people walking in the door, wanting to file their applications and gain work authorization and protection from deportations. And so we came together to figure out how could we collaborate and maximize the complementary strengths of our direct service organizations and our grassroots organizations. We also recognized that there was insufficient funding and resources to support this work, that even if we were able to build a service model, we didn't have the resources available to fund that work to make sure that every organization was able to participate and provide the level of services that their community needed. Obviously, we all know DAPA didn't actually happen, but the need for services in our communities, especially in rural and suburban communities outside of the urban centers of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, these areas were still underserved. And obviously, we still needed to increase the resources available to our partners who had a lot of barriers in accessing what they needed. So we first started with funder education and really operating from an attitude of abundance instead of competition. I always like to say that we are refusing to engage in the nonprofit cage match. Other people call it the nonprofit Hunger Games. But the idea that there is not enough money available is a myth. Foundations are sitting on billions of dollars of endowments, and that there are choices being made to not distribute that money and put it back and invest it back into our communities. So we started with going to funders and educating them, one, about why groups came together in the first place. Originally talking about DAPA and the initial need to file those applications, but then over the years, just continuing to educate funders about what it means to build a movement for immigrant rights. And that has been, I think, a real source of strength because funders are consistently impressed to see, 10, 15, 20 organizations working together, united behind a message, and united behind a clear demand for what our movements and our communities need. This also allows us to demonstrate the breadth and diversity of the immigrant rights movement in Pennsylvania and show that all pieces of the ecosystem, the movement ecosystem, are necessary, right? We can't just fund direct services. We can't just fund organizing. We need to fund all of it. We need to make sure that we're meeting our community's immediate needs and taking care of their material well-being. And we need to be working on that long-term systems change so that we're not just repetitively over and over and over trying to fix these immediate issues, but we need to change those systems so that we're increasing the overall long-term well-being of our communities. We also see that PIC, in our position as a statewide organization and a policy-focused organization, and also me being a white executive director, means that we often have access to rooms that our grassroots partners just do not have access to, and that we will be heard by people that maybe are not quite ready to directly engage our grassroots partners. So we really view it as our job to leverage that access and leverage those conversations to bring in the voices and the needs of our communities. We also see funder briefings as a place to create a relatively low risk space to name and push back on a lot of the harmful philanthropic practices we see. It is risky to go straight to a funder and tell them that their practices are exclusionary. I mean, I think like Heather's story is phenomenal to really confront an unjust practice straight to the funder and say this needs to change. Some organizations feel like that's a risk that they're not yet ready to take, or it's not feasible to just do that alone if no one else is behind you, backing you up on that conversation. And so funder briefings like the one that we held this summer, we were able to frame and host in partnership with PIC, NCRP, and a local foundation, and bring in our grassroots partners as local experts so that they were able to share their experiences, name some of the issues that they were facing in accessing philanthropy, such as needing a simple and clear application process. Especially many of our grassroots partners are immigrant-led. English is their second language. Often foundation websites or application processes are not super friendly if you're not well-versed in that language, the language of funding, much less English as a language. The need for a simple reporting process, the need for long-term funding and general operating funds. And by hosting these briefings, we are giving space both for our partners to voice some of these challenges and barriers, and also educate funders about why a tiny volunteer-led organization that only works with one particular community in one city is really important to the overall ecosystem, because they are the trusted messenger and the trusted voice in their community, and that we need to pay attention to those really tiny groups the same way we pay attention to the really large service providers or large organizing organizations. The next way that PA is Ready, I think, really helps build collective power around allocating resources and raising more money for our movement is through our participatory grant making model. So this is really about directly putting the decision-making power directly in the hands of the experts. And the experts are community leaders and service providers who every day are working in immigrant and refugee communities and understand what is most needed. And so this is a pooled fund where we ask our institutional funders and donors to really invest in this pooled fund. And then our member organizations actually make all of the decisions about what are the overall funding priorities, and then also evaluate and make the direct grant decisions, and evaluate those applications and make the decisions. And what we have found is that this process has both shifted dynamics between funders and sort of their traditional grantees, which is all of our partners, but also really given our partners tools to really shift their, think about the power dynamics of funding your peers. Like, how do we collectively build and manage our resources in a way where, again, we're operating out of an attitude of abundance. So it's not like, well, if I give you a $30,000 grant, then I'm not going to get that grant. But how are we allocating these resources in a way that we know makes sense and is making our communities stronger all across the strait together? It also, this peer-based system also gives access to groups, again, that are often excluded. We have so many partners that are volunteer-led, and PA is Ready they're potentially the only entrance they have to getting funding, because They don't have a 990. They don't have a financial history. They don't have a budget because they're just financing their work out of their pocket because they know that their community needs this, but they don't actually have external funding to support the work. And, you know, as peers, we know and we can see the amazing work these small groups are doing in a way that, you know, potentially foundations or other donors can't see. So Peers Ready is a way to bring those folks in, begin to give them the money they need to be able to build their internal capacity and support their work and be sustainable, and also introduce them to philanthropy, introduce them to other funders so they can continue to build their internal infrastructure. The second way that PIC really views, like, how do we think about collaborative fundraising is through a subgranting process. So again, as a coalition, you know, I think all of the work that PIC does, we are stronger and we are better able to do our work as an organization when our member organizations are strong. When I first started at PIC, I was hired to work on immigration reform way back in 2013, again, when proactive good policies were on the table. And the first coalition meeting I attended for immigration reform, there were, you know, 40 organizations around the table, and only 4 or 5 were grassroots community-led organizations. And to me, that's not how we build a movement that's going to win, right? We really need to ensure that immigrants and refugees are at the fore making decisions about our campaigns and about the work that needs to happen for justice and liberation. And so we don't just fundraise for PIC, we also fundraise for our partners. So when we're thinking about opportunities of whether it's, you know, fighting for tuition equity or, you know, fighting for local policies that separate ICE and police law enforcement, obviously we want to, you know, fund our work as an organization, but we also want to make sure that the grassroots groups and community-led groups that are also on the ground doing the day-to-day work to mobilize and organize are also being resourced. And so we always try to think about, how are we raising money for PIC, and how are we bringing our members with us? How are we ensuring that they have the resources they need so that they can do this work? Again, really shifting our attitude to work from a framework of abundance. Like, there is enough for all of us. And the more that we fight for all of us together and with each other, the more we're actually able to change the funding landscape to ensure that we all have what we need to build a more just society. And finally, on capacity building, obviously funding is critical. You know, as long as we live in a capitalist system, we need to pay rent and we need to feed our families. But that isn't everything. And so we also really work to support our partners to give them the, you know, whatever the training, the organizational capacity building work that is going to help them be stronger organizations to lead their movement, the movement for immigrant rights, and provide the services that their communities need. And I think that's where I'll end for now.
Thanks so much, Sundrop. There's just so many snaps. I was like, yes, that is right. And NPNA does a lot of regrants too. You know, 1/3 of our budget goes out to member organizations. And so I definitely understand a lot of the points that you were mentioning. And thank you so much just for the incredible work you guys are doing in Pennsylvania. All right, so I'll turn it back over to Ben to introduce our next speakers.
Thanks, Nancy, and thanks, Sundrop. So this next question is for our folks on the call who work more closely with funders. So in the era of COVID-19, many nonprofits have seen an impact on their budgets, and it's especially affected organizations that were already struggling prior to the pandemic. So Kevin and Monica, this question is for you. I'll start with you, Kevin, first. How have you seen funders react to the COVID-19 crisis so far? And what should folks know about what funders are thinking about now, given your role as a philanthropic membership and support organization?
Sure, that's a great question. And I'm so honored to sort of follow all of the great presenters we've heard so far from the field who really have a lot to offer in terms of how to think about fundraising. So as you mentioned, GSER is a philanthropic support organization. So what that means is we're positioned in sort of a unique position where we're not quite funders, we're not in the field, and really our work is to try to educate and push funders really to invest in immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. So we have a little bit of a macro perspective about how funders writ large are thinking about these issues. And so when we think about 2020 and sort of how funders reacted, there was some good news. We saw that there was increases in giving. We saw there was increases in funder flexibility. And we saw there was an increase in focus on racial justice. And these were sort of the three things that came to my mind in terms of how philanthropic practices had shifted in 2020. And I was pleased to see that those were actually affirmed by some research that had been done earlier this year that really did an analysis of 250 foundation leaders across the country and really found this. So, one of the key findings was that 60% of foundations had to increase their giving this year beyond what their plan levels were, with an average increase of 17%. 25% of all, grant making 2020 went to COVID, which is obviously a new and unexpected area and required flexibility and, funders willing to sort of do things a little bit differently. 11% of funders took on racial equity as a primary or new focus relative to the beginning of the year. And 85% said that they had adopted flexible grant-making practices for the grantees, whether it was, 3/4 had loosened grant requirements, 2/3 had reduced reporting requirements. Those 2/3 allowed folks to redirect how their money was used, and almost 2/3 allowed folks to extend their grant timelines. So taken together, it's sort of an encouraging set of findings in what can otherwise be sort of a discouraging sort of space, which is to think about how do we pry loose resources from philanthropy to the folks who most need it and are doing the work day to day. When folks were asked about sort of moving forward, how they were thinking, the overwhelming majority said they were thinking about new grantees or new programming focuses, 82% of respondents. Half of them said that they were considering new DEI practices internally or in their grant making. So all of that to me indicates there's real opportunity for leaders in the movement to think strategically about how they tap into this new, amount of funding that's out there, this more new flexibility on funders' behalf, and then also new areas of focus. There are areas for concern that we are thinking about as an affinity group in philanthropy and trying to encourage our members to pay attention to. One is, there's a big fear around drop-offs in support. Biden was elected, and folks wrongly attribute the negative impacts on immigrants over the last few years to only Trump, and not really understanding that there was deep structural flaws in our immigration system that predated Trump, and he really just exploited and uncovered a lot of them. And so the election of Biden in and of itself doesn't mean those issues are solved, but for funders who came into the fold after Trump's election in response to family separation and crises, there is some concern about whether there's going to be longevity behind their giving, or whether they'll sort of see this moment of crisis as over and move on to other priorities. And so one of the things that we're encouraging folks to think about, and for groups on the ground to think about, is to help funders see this as a moment to capitalize on those investments. If they sort of reach into sort of discretionary pots or emergency relief or crisis response, how much more effective would it be to fund the groups who are working on systems change to avoid those needs to sort of go to the board and ask for crisis funding moving forward? So that's something we're definitely keeping an eye on and something to be aware of. Another is this sort of competing priorities. Every issue, every movement has its champions and leaders, and they're all valid. And there's going to be sort of some jockeying for position, both within the sector, but then also within philanthropy, which issues are really focused on. And even if we look at sort of Biden's transition priorities, immigration has not been named among them. He has named a number of key issues that he will take on that relate to immigration, but he has 4 priorities, which are COVID-19, economic recovery, racial equity, and climate change. Obviously, immigrant communities and refugee asylum seekers are impacted by all of those issues, but it's not a specific immigrant-focused strategy. And so that has implications for how philanthropy will think about the ability for immigration issues to move forward if it's not a named priority of the administration. And so as funders are growing their racial equity giving, growing their climate change investments, it'll be on sort of folks in the field to think about how do they tell a story, how do they weave together sort of intersectional approaches that funders can see as germane and something that they can do even if immigration sort of not top of list for them. When we do talk to our membership about immigration specifically, there are a number of areas that funders are thinking about. One of them is about border response. I'm sure everyone is aware that there is a concern that when Biden comes into office, folks will sort of see an opportunity to pursue asylum in a way that hasn't been allowed in the past few years, with the rolling back potentially of the migrant protection protocols, expedited removal, et cetera. And so there'll be a real humanitarian need at the border. And so that is something that funders are beginning to think about. What does the infrastructure on both sides of the border look like? From shelters to food to case management to legal services to transportation. And so I think that's an area right for folks to think about how they might respond if they have the capacity. Legal services writ large. We know that many of the folks on this webinar are going to be pushing for legalization and naturalization pathways, whether it's for DACA or TPS or essential workers, or the 11 million undocumented folks in the country really welcoming them in through a formal pathway. And if any of those things comes to pass, legal services will be necessary to sort of facilitate those opportunities. Narrative change is another piece that funders are really interested in at all levels. There are various theories of change, theories about how you change and how you make change. And people are dissecting the electorate and the voting and sort of the election outcomes. And part of what a slice of philanthropy and a slice of the field, to be honest, is thinking about is, are there different messages that can reach folks who, have supported xenophobic policies? And is there different messages that will reach them? Or are there new creative ways to reach the base and mobilize them to sort of push for change? And so thinking about narrative and communication strategies is an area of interest for a lot of funders. Civic engagement and democracy came into high relief in the last year, with a lot of threats to our democracy being leveraged, and funders who hadn't traditionally funded that space, thinking about the intersections between their work, including immigration funders, and civic engagement and democracy. And so I think in the year ahead, looking at sort of the follow-up to the census and redistricting, that's an area where there's some opportunity. And then finally, state level opportunities. Not all funders are engaged at the national level or thinking about that. A lot are regionally focused and are interested in sort of what it means for their grantees to engage in sort of state level work or local level work in either an offensive or defensive capacity. And so that's another place that funders are thinking about. So I'll close here in a second. I think what my recommendation would be, just from sort of like the position that we sit in and hearing some of these conversations, is for those to think about the intersectional approaches that they can take to their work. Linking immigrant issues to racial justice issues, to climate change, to economic recovery, and telling the story in a way that speaks to a funder. Collaborations, this was mentioned earlier. Funders love collaboration. They love novel opportunities. They don't want to be the last one to a new sort of strategy or idea. And so thinking about where those collaborations and new exciting efforts will be of interest to some funders. Gaps are something that funders always ask about. What are the gaps? Who's funding what and what is not being funded? And so helping funders understand in your community what are like their real specific gaps and the strategies to address them is something that always has resonance. And then finally, understanding the funder. Everyone thinks they're unique, and folks in philanthropy will say, if you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. And it's kind of true in the same way it would be for any movement organization. But understanding the theory of change for a funder, whether they're primarily a service-oriented funder or a movement-oriented funder, or just understanding how they see the world and how they see change, will help you sort of better tailor your message and your pitch, whether it's because you're speaking to their theory or whether you're sort of challenging them to expand on their theory. So those are some of the recommendations I'd make in terms of approaching funders in this new environment. But I think I will leave it there and give it back to you, Ben.
Thanks, Kevin. Really important timely insights for us all to think about where funders' mindsets are right now. And to continue that conversation, Monica, I'll pose to you the same question. As a funder yourself and as someone who talks to peer foundations and funders, what do you think folks should know about where philanthropy's head is right now?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. And so excited to build on just the amazing wisdom and insights shared by every one of the speakers thus far. And also thanks, Kevin, for really sort of painting that helpful picture at the national level of where different funders are in their own journeys around supporting immigrant and refugee communities in the movement. Just as a little context about World Education Services and the West Mariama Sefa Fund, we sort of sit in an interesting place. We straddle a little bit the world of being a nonprofit social enterprise ourselves, as well as being a funder. WES has been around for over 45 years, supporting immigrants, refugees, and international students in achieving their educational and career goals in both the US and in Canada. And about a year and a half ago, we launched our philanthropic arm, the West Mary Masefa Fund. And this was something that we seeded ourselves with our own resources through surplus that we've generated with Wes's products and services. It was essential to us that we be reinvesting those resources back into immigrant and refugee communities through social impact initiatives and tools like philanthropic capital. So it's interesting to be in this conversation because I absolutely have my funder hat on, but I'm also really thinking about this from a lot of your seats too, as we are an organization ourselves that is cares a lot about keeping our staff supported, keeping the lights on, making sure that we're able to deliver high quality products, services, and programs to our customers and our partners around the world. And so when the West Mary Masefa Fund launched, we launched with a North Star of supporting immigrant and refugee workers and ensuring that they are able to access economic mobility, good jobs, family-sustaining jobs, and that at the systems level, we're contributing to more equitable, inclusive, and just economies in the US and in Canada. As we went about that process of developing our strategy, we really wanted to center it on immigrant and refugee communities and immigrant and refugee serving organizations themselves, to listen to them around, Kevin rightly put, what are the gaps? You tell us. We know there's a lot of solutions and levers required both at the individual and the systemic levels to drive change. And so we have gone over the last year and a half in sort of that listening journey and heard things that would not be surprising. We need more support for workforce development and training programs, English language learning, career pathways, skill building. We need wraparound supports like childcare and healthcare to support workers and their families, but also things that look more holistically about what does economic mobility mean, wealth building initiatives, worker ownership models, financial inclusion. So that has all been inordinately helpful as we've been identifying funding priorities and putting our first dollars out the door. But we've also been spending a lot of time in equal measure thinking about what kind of funder do we want to be? What kind of partner do we want to be? As you heard from Sundrop and Heather, I mean, there's just amazing examples out there of what a good philanthropy can look like and what not so good philanthropy can look like. And so we want to learn from others, experiment ourselves, but really make sure that we're living our organizational values, equity, inclusion, opportunity as a funder. And particularly in light of this year, felt even more important as we started to hear from our grantee partners around the challenges they and their staff and their communities were navigating amidst the health and social and economic impacts of COVID-19. So, I'd love to just share a few of our reflections on some of the trends we're seeing in the local, national, and international conversations around what does it mean to democratize philanthropy? What can funders practically do on that front? And Sundrop shared some great examples, as well as how can we look ahead and really push towards redistributing power between philanthropy and communities, especially in light of the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and structural racism. I think there's ideas in there and maybe some practical next steps on how you might engage with your current and as well as potential funders. I mean, I do really believe that this is a moment where philanthropy must, and I think we're making progress, change for the better and really think about how are we truly partnering and centering communities and redistributing power, not just from strategy, but also to decision-making back to communities. And I think there's a lot of promising examples of how this is happening. These sort of values are happening in different spaces. Think about participatory budgeting that may or may not be happening in your community, your city, crowdfunding, community-oriented development, but also too seeing how awardees and movements are pushing back against funders. Organizations saying, I will not take dollars from a funder that doesn't reflect my values. That is, I think, a huge step in a direction we'd like to see where organizations are being held accountable to live the values they say and really serve the communities that they purport to through their mission. And I think a thing that really excites me in the conversations we have with funders is around the trust-based philanthropy movement, which includes amazing practices like participatory grant making. And I think, there are examples we're starting to see. I mean, PA is Ready is fantastic as a participatory grant making model. We're seeing big, large global foundations like the Ford Foundation stating a commitment, not just that participatory grant making and funding is important, but that they're exploring it and how they, to use their own words, will seed the power of grant decisions. And others, one of our grantee partners, the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation, has been organizing several conversations around how can we shift power balances in philanthropy. And they had a great conversation with an organization called the Heron Foundation, who was one of the early pioneers in shifting 100% of their endowment to quote unquote impact. And over that journey, they discovered that it's not enough just to have all of your foundation assets invested for impact, but actually you need to turn those resources over to communities and support them in deploying them. That even still the act of strategy development can be quite extractive, as I'm sure you all know. And the act of funding too is still, even if it is for impact, can still not be really centered on the needs of communities. So, I think signals like this encourage me, and I think I really love the examples that Heather was sharing around how can we have opportunities for inside and outside games to pressure from the field and from leaders more of this from other funders, as well as tap into champions within funders to help them push the needle within their own organizations to grow and ensure that practices like this become the new normal. I'll say for the West Mary Masafa Fund, as we've thought about adopting and deploying a trust-based philanthropy framework, for us, some of the things that we've been experimenting with include, how do you simplify your funding applications? Never ask for any information you don't need to make the decision. Keep it as simple as possible. Providing a ton of transparency and support to your applicants. If helping organizations understand what are the eligibility requirements, what are we trying to, what kinds of solutions are being looked for. That way, no one wastes their time on an application that isn't going to be a right fit for them or their organization. Time is very precious. We also, for a recent funding round, brought in an external selection committee of community leaders, national experts on different issues, and said to them, you help us decide who are the top 20 from this. And when we ended up having even more organizations than we had initially planned to support, we're able to bring in more resources to reflect sort of the wisdom of the committee and where they thought the most promising ideas were. And I love the idea too around thinking about where can you, as a, for the funders out there, how do you think about providing resources to applicants, even those who aren't selected? How can you, certainly Sundrop mentioned, I think, a great example of supporting fundraising for your grantee partners, which 1,000%, yes, and please. But also too, there are resources inevitably are finite. And so there might be amazing leaders and organizations that you just aren't able to support. How do you get them in front of other funders? What are opportunities to share their stories? Several folks have spoken about the general operating support and flexible multi-year checks. Yes and yes. Even for organizations that are looking for specific ideas or initiatives, making sure do away with any caps on indirect funding expenses. Make sure that they've got the flexibility to move budget around as needed. And also too, supporting your partners in investing in their staff, and in particularly these days in mental health and wellness of staff, providing a little buffer in your funding for that. And then offering support to your partners beyond the check. For any funders out there, these are all things that are imminently doable, and there are just so many resources out there, from NCRP to Grantcraft to Center for Effective Philanthropy, that can help you put these into practice. So, and I say too to the immigrant and justice leaders and practitioners out there, a few suggestions as you're working with either your current funders or new funders, how to push them to adopt practices like this, and specific tactics. This might be a little in the weeds, but specific tactics you can explore in your own partnerships with them. I think, oftentimes, first and foremost, when you're negotiating an agreement with a partner, how can you be pushing to be, if there are reports and deliverables required, where's there space to co-create those and define success together? Asking the question and really pushing them to allow you to use reports or similar documents that you are using for other funders, so you're not creating all the things for all the people. I think another important aspect is how your work is communicated. And, I think funders often have their own verbiage that they want to apply, and they have their own agenda when they're trying to communicate the work and leadership of their partners. So making sure that you maintain your voice in that, and even if it comes into negotiating terms like that into the grant agreement, and also sharing the kind of language you prefer when describing your partners, your communities, your work. I think foundations and philanthropy are trying to move towards more of an asset-based framing versus deficit, but really helping them to understand what is important to you and why when communicating about the work you lead. As we mentioned before, I think so many funders are moving towards general operating support, particularly, well, maybe so many might be an exaggeration, but a lot are, particularly for their current partners. And so if you haven't had that conversation with an existing funder, I think there's a wealth of great resources out there on why organizations should put, be it their culture, precedent, ego, whatever the reason is, aside and make that happen. And we can certainly share some of those so you can be armed with them when you go and have that conversation with your funders. And then also, lastly, asking them what kind of support can they provide beyond the check? What intros can they make to other funders or other kinds of partners? What kinds of support, technical assistance, capacity building? How do they think about their community of partners? Of course, the financial support is absolutely essential, but there are so many other things that are required to help you be as successful and impactful as possible. And what role can funders play in enabling that for you? And that being part of their role as a funder, not just the check cutter. So those are just a few tips and thoughts, from being on both sides of the funding table that we'd share. But, really hope that these can be things, we're going to share, I think, some resources after this of examples too, that hopefully can help you in driving more impact in your communities and helping us all contribute to this more equitable philanthropic field.
Thanks, Monica. So many useful, concrete tips that I think will be helpful for folks on the call. Nancy, I'll hand things back over to you to wrap things up.
Yes, thank you, Ben. And we'll be putting into the chat some of the resources that were mentioned so that they can be useful to all of you. So that's where you can find some of these things, is in the chat of this thread here. So for our last question, I want to do a very quick kind of lightning round, and this is for all of our panelists. So what final thoughts or piece of advice would you share with people listening today that perhaps we didn't touch on, or that you wanted to just elaborate? So this is a lightning round, very quick, but we want to hear from all of our panelists as we close out this section. So we'll kick it off with Rovika.
Thanks, Nancy. I'm going first again. So I just want to say I loved hearing from Heather and Sundrop and how they've challenged the funding community. And Kevin and Monica about how the fundraising landscape is changing to be more inclusive and open, including DEI practices in their grant making. I guess the last thing I would say is that if philanthropy can't respond in this moment where we're facing a global pandemic and global reckoning on racial justice, then when? I want to impress that the moment is now, and we will keep pushing that message out. We know how much work that needs to happen and how much suffering is happening right now. And we really do need philanthropy to respond in this moment. And one way or the other, we'll keep pushing on that. And there's a chance right now to really open up clear and open communications with funders. And I really hope and want to see that happen. I also want to uplift what Monica said about support for the folks who are doing the kinds of work that we're doing, such as mental health support. Kevin and I actually just had a conversation about this a few weeks ago and how this is so desperately needed in our field and how we need to shift in the nonprofit industry to make sure we're all cared for and that we continue to do the critical work we're doing and not dealing with the immense burnout of our field. So I was really glad to hear a number of these things being uplifted and really look forward to seeing what happens next. Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks, Rovika. And I will hand things off to Heather to keep this final thought train going.
Yeah, thank you. I really like what Monica said about shifting power, as as representatives of grassroots organizations, nonprofits, holding foundations accountable to the things that they're saying and making sure that what they're doing in their practices aligns with your values. And if they don't, you take your business elsewhere, that there's real privilege that is bestowed upon funders to be able to invest in our work, and that we have to remember that. We have to remember that when we're championing our causes. I think the other bit of wisdom that I've gained just with this advocacy effort over the summer is the importance of data. A colleague and I are leading a round of conversations with other funders that have had huge disparities in their contributions to Black organizations based on looking at 10 years of 990s. And we have presented that information in closed sessions with funders, and they were shocked and surprised to even see this data. They are completely oblivious and unaware. And so as a community, making sure that we're keeping on top of the data and that we're holding funders, again, to what they're saying and making sure that it aligns with what they're doing, I think is really important for all of us to remember and not to lose sight of.
Great. Thanks so much, Heather. Same question. We'll turn it over to you, Sundrop.
Yes, I just want to double down on what Heather just said. I think, working with grassroots partners, I think organizers are some of the most courageous, creative, brave people out there who are down to confront power in lots of different ways. And I feel like sometimes when we step into spaces with funders, we forget that power. And to me, that is we need to bring all of that power into spaces with foundations and with funders. And that is I think one of the lessons of PA is Ready is that when we stand in that space and we really say this is what our movement needs, this is what our community needs. And our whole movement is standing right here telling you that is the moment that really shifts the power dynamic and really forces funders to confront that, fundamentally they are allies to this movement. They don't get to make the decisions about our movement. So, I think really remembering that you as organizers have the power and funders have a tool that is going to help us get to the world we're trying to build.
Thank you so much, Sundrop. Kevin, same question to you.
Sure. It has been an absolute pleasure to be on this panel with my colleagues. And honestly, my recommendation is to rewatch this session and write down everything Rovika and Heather and Sundrop and Monica shared. I think they were so brilliant, had a lot of great insights. If there were one other thing I would mention, it would just be to lift up again, finding the intersectional approaches in this year, really looking at sort of the realities of where the country is and what the administration's priorities will be and where funder priorities are, and thinking about how to align or at least tell the story of the alignment between your work and those priorities. So yeah, that would be my piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Nancy, you want to hand it off to Monica?
Yeah, absolutely. Give us
all right. Thank you, Nancy. Pressure is on being the last person. It's hard to wrap us up after all of those amazing last remarks. But I guess the two things I would share for maybe our dual audiences here. I mean, for funders, my guidance is probably pretty simple. I mean, remember, there's no reason for us to exist if it weren't for the communities and the organizations we are working on behalf of. So at the end of the day, we need to be listening and we need to be learning and we need to be working in lockstep with them to support them. And then for all of the amazing immigrant and refugee serving organizations and leaders out there, I mean, keep doing what you're doing. We need more of you and more of the amazing impact you're driving. And, I love the point, Sundrop, you just made about keeping your power and telling your story in the way that you want to tell it and not the way that I think there's, of course, always strategery, shall we say, in how you position yourselves with different audiences and with different funders where there's asks on the table, but not being afraid to say what's important to you and why, even if that's going to run counter to maybe what a funder thinks. We all need to be pushed. So anyways, thank you all again for just such a fantastic session. I can't wait to rewatch this.
Thank you, Monica, and just all of today's panelists for sharing your expertise and guidance. I hope that you all watching enjoyed today's session. We really wanted to share what's working? You know, what are some examples from different parts of the country, different types of organizations, and how we've been able to push the envelope, especially in this critical time. I hope that we were able to provide you with some pragmatic tools for these challenging times. So on my behalf, thank you so much, and I'll kick it over to my co-moderator to close us out here.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, I echo everything that you said, everything the panelists said. What we've heard today really runs the gamut from solid fundraising tips to power building strategies. And I think it's just important to remember that the true wealth is in our communities, and really this money belongs to all of us. So thank you all for your time today, and we'll keep the conversation going offline.